All right, so today we're going to start looking at solving systems of equations using a new method. So far you know how to solve systems of equations using graphing. You know how to solve them using elimination. You should know how to solve them using substitution, right? So today we're looking at how to solve a system of equations using a matrix. Okay, you have probably never seen this before. It's going to be weird. It's going to feel really hard and complicated, okay? We're starting out with pretty small systems of equations. There's just two variables and there's only two equations. Okay, later we're going to solve systems that have three variables. So they'll have an x, y, and a z and three equations. Okay, so those ones are going to be a little bit more complicated. So we're starting with the smaller ones to really help you nail what the basics are so that you'll be prepared for those. Okay, so here's a system of equations, and I'm going to show you how we can set up some different things using that system. So first of all, just to see what these things look like, I'm not going to ask you to be able to name these different things. You're just going to need to be able to use them. All right, so a coefficient matrix is just you take the coefficients from your equations, not including the answers, just the coefficients in front of your variables, and you set them up in a matrix. And here's what a matrix looks like. It's kind of got these big little bracket thingies, and then you just make a grid. So I'm making a grid with those numbers. You can see that they show up in the same order. So the 5 and the 2, and then the 3 and the -2. And then you close the bracket on the other side. Okay, so that's the coefficient matrix. It's a matrix, it's just got the coefficients. Okay, an augmented matrix is when you make a matrix, so it's going to look like this, but we augment it when we add the answers in as well. Okay, so an augmented matrix, you start with this bracket thing. Just like the last one, you start with your coefficients in a little grid. And then when you add the answers, you add this vertical line here so that it's kind of an indicator that these are like the answers to the equation. And then you just add your solutions, your answers to these equations into this grid. Okay, so you can see that this is the same as this, except we got rid of the x's and the y's. We replaced the equal sign with a line, and we threw some brackets around it. Okay, so that's what an augmented matrix is. So our first thing that we're going to do is we're going to write this augmented matrix, and then we're going to use some different steps to transform this into something called reduced diagonal form. Okay, so here's what that's going to look like. Same sort of setup where we're going to have our grid, but the numbers in our grid are going to be 1, 0, 0, 1. So you get ones on the main diagonal and zeros everywhere else. Okay, and then our answers will be whatever our answers happen to be. This particular problem, the answers are -2 and then +1. So it would look like that. Okay, so our goal is to make it look like this on the left. And then once you've done that, you can take from this reduced diagonal form, you can take your solutions, which are these two. So my solutions from this would be that x equals -2 and y equals 1, or the point -2, 1. Okay, so that's going to be what our goal is. So we haven't talked about how to do this yet, but our goal is going to be you're taking your system, you're writing a matrix, which is really easy. We're going to do some transformation stuff to get it looking like this. And then we'll just take those answers right from the right-hand side. And that's how we get our answer. Okay, so that's your overall goal for this. Okay, so goal, write the equation in augmented matrix, transform it into reduced diagonal form. So let's talk about the rules. There's basically some things that you are allowed to do and some things that you are not allowed to do when you talk about a matrix. So here's what you can do. You can switch to rows. Okay, so you could take like the numbers in the top and the numbers in the bottom and just swap them, which makes sense because like I could have just as easily written this equation, right? These systems of equations. I could have written the second equation on the top and it wouldn't change anything. Okay, so swapping rows is allowed. Thing number 2 that you can do is you can multiply or divide a row by a number. So like I could take this whole top row and multiply it by, say, 5. Okay, so that is something that's allowed, or I could divide it by 2, right? And again, that makes sense because that's the same sort of step we did when we were doing elimination, right? We would multiply or divide a row by a number so that we could cancel something. So that's an allowed operation. Thing number 3 is you're allowed to add or subtract 2 rows, which again, that makes sense because that's something that we were allowed to do with elimination, right? We would add the 2 rows together, the 2 equations, so that we cancel out a variable. Okay, and then Obviously, you can do combinations of the above. So you could multiply a row by a number and then add it to another one. Okay, so you might be thinking to yourself, well, if these are all the same things that we did in elimination, why are we bothering with these? Like, why not just do elimination? Well, when we're looking at these particular systems, these small ones, yeah, it really does make more sense to do elimination. But when we start looking at the bigger systems, it makes more sense to use a matrix. But I don't want to start teaching you with matrices with something that's big and complicated. I want to start you with something smaller and easier. Okay, so that's why we're starting with these small ones, even though, yeah, you'd really be better off using elimination for these. All right, so let's work through this example, okay? So first step is gonna be, we're gonna write an augmented matrix, okay? So I kind of set up for you here like the general setup of what these matrices look like so you can just fill the numbers in. So the first thing we're gonna do is we're just gonna take this guy and we're gonna pop numbers in here. There's an invisible 1 in front of the X that's understood to be there, right? So it's gonna be a 1, a 4, a 3, a 2, and then on the other side of the line is where the answers go, right? So the -4 and the 8. So that's step 1. We've now written our augmented matrix. Okay, step 2 is we want to get a 1 in any diagonal position. So remember, our goal is that it looks like this on the left, right? So we want a 1 here and a 1 here, okay? And then we want zeros there. So your first goal is to either going to get this to be a 1 or to make that be a 1, okay? It doesn't matter which one you start with, but that's your first goal, is to get a 1. Now, this particular problem, we already have that. Okay, so when I take a look at this guy, I can see that I have a 1 here. So step 2 has been accomplished. Okay, step 3 is now we're going to use that row to get the zeros in the rest of the column. Okay, so you'll note that there's a note here. It says important. Okay, always finish a column that's up and down before moving on to another row that's sideways. Okay, so we have this 1 here. So our next goal is going to be that we need to make this into a 0. Okay, so we're finishing a column first. We have this 1, so we're going to finish the column by making this into a 0. Okay, so that's what our goal is here, is we need to get rid of that 3 and make it a 0. All right, and the way that you're going to do that is you're going to multiply the first row by the opposite of the number that needs to become a 0 and then add. Okay, so the number that needs to become a 0 is the 3. So I'm going to multiply row 1 by -3, and then I'll add them together. Okay, just like you would with elimination. All right, now when you do this, you need to write what's called a row operation off to the side. So you have to write down what exactly you did. Okay, so here's what I'm going to write. I'm going to say that I did -3 times the first row, row 1. So it's an R with a little subscript of 1. I'm going to add it to row 2. And then I'm going to put that answer in row 2. Okay, so we're going to multiply this guy by -3, add it to this guy, and then write my answer in the bottom row. Okay, all right, so I'm going to do my side work over here. I want to just be able to write that final answer in my next step. So over on the side here, I'm going to do out some work. So I said I was going to do -3 times row 1. So I'm going to start by just multiplying this top row by -3. So 1 times -3, 4 times -3, -4 times -3. And I said I was going to add it to row 2, so I'm just going to copy that below. There's just row 2 again. And we said we were adding them together. So these will add to 0. This is going to add to -10, and that's going to add to 20. Okay, so this is going to be what my new row is, and we said we were going to put it in row 2. Okay, so this is now going to go down the bottom. Okay, my top row is just staying the same. Okay, even though I did as a step, I multiplied by -3 on the top row just as a step to figure out my next part. That's okay. I'm still just going to keep it the same because I don't want to get rid of that 1. Okay, so now you can see that we have the 1 and the 0 and our first column is done. All right, so again, I had the 1 and I multiplied it by the opposite of this number and then added them together to get my new row. Okay, so now our next step is now we need to get another 1. Okay, so I've got this column done. So this column is all set. And now what my goal is going to be is I got to get the next 1. Okay, so you don't want to focus on zeros first, focus on 1s. Okay, so Looking at this guy, I need to make where this negative 10 is, I need to make that into a 1. Okay, so what you're going to do is when you get to this one where you're in your last one that you're trying to get, usually that's a good spot where you're going to divide a row. Okay, so do you see how everything here is divisible by negative 10? And if I divide it by negative 10, I'll get a 1 there. So that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to take row 2, I'm going to divide it by negative 10 and just put it right back where it was. So I'm taking row 2, dividing it by negative 10, and putting it back into row 2. Okay, so I'm going to divide each of those numbers by negative 10 and just put it back. So 0 divided by negative 10 is 0. Negative 10 divided by negative 10 is 1. 20 divided by negative 10 is negative 2. Okay, and then this first row, I'm just copying over. Okay, great. So now we got 3/4 of the way there, right? I've got a 1, a 0, and a 1. I just need to make that 4 into a 1. So now we're going to go back and we're going to do a very similar step to what we did here, right? Here I looked at this and I said, well, what do I multiply the 1 by to get rid of this guy? Right? I'm going to do the same thing here. What do I multiply 1 by to get rid of 4? Negative 4. Okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to multiply this row by negative 4 so that when I add these together, they'll cancel. Okay? So I'm going to do negative 4 times the second row, and I'm going to add it to the first row and put the answer in the first row because that's where I want the 0 to show up. Okay, and then I'm going to do my workout over here. So negative 4 times row 2 would be 0, negative 4, 8. Copy row 1 right below it, add those together. I'm going to get 1, 0, 4. Okay, so this is why it was so important. Remember how I said you have to make sure you finish a column first? This is why, because if we hadn't finished this column, then we would have ended up changing the 1. The reason why this number gets to stay a 1 is because this guy was a 0 and zeros don't really do much, right? So if this hadn't been a 0 here, then it would have screwed up our 1 and we would have had to go back and do the first step again. Okay, so that's kind of the reason why that's important. So I'm going to write this number here. So it's 104, that's my new row. And the other row I didn't change, so that I'm just copying down. Okay, and that right there, now we've got what we wanted. So I've got 1s in the main diagonal and 0s everywhere else. So that's what my answer looks like. Okay, so the last step that you have to do is just actually write what your solution is as a point. So my solution is the point 4, negative 2. And I get that from these numbers right here. Okay, so I know this feels complicated and weird, all right, but we're going to keep practicing these and you'll see kind of where they come from the more that we do them. All right, so flip over to your next page and let's take a look at another example. Okay, so first thing we're going to do again is I'm just going to set up my augmented matrix. So brackets, and you just write these numbers in order and put a line to separate the coefficients from the answers. All right, so now the first thing that we need to do is we need to get that 1. Okay, so it doesn't matter where the 1 ends up. We want it to end up being in one of these two spots, but remember we can switch rows if we need to. Okay, so I'm just looking for really any way that I can get a 1 somewhere because I don't have that yet on this one. So I'm looking at, say, this top row, and the things that I'm allowed to do with a row, I can swap 2 rows, but that's not going to help me because I don't have any 1s anywhere. Okay, I can multiply or divide a row by a number, or I could add or subtract 2 rows. Okay, well, adding and subtracting isn't going to get me a 1 anywhere. So let's look at multiplying and dividing. This guy, there's nothing I can multiply or divide this row by that'll give me anything except fractions, right? I can't stick with whole numbers here. So that's not a good row to work with. But this row, I could divide everything by 2 and still have whole numbers. And when I do that, that'll get me a 1 here. It's not quite in the right spot, but then I'll be able to swap the 2 rows and then it will be in the right spot. Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to do with this guy is I'm going to take row 2. So I'm writing R2 for row 2. I'm dividing it by 2. And then I'm just going to put it right back where it was in row 2. Okay, so I'm just going to take every number in this row and I'm going to divide it by 2. Okay, so the top row I'm not doing anything with yet, so I'm just going to recopy that. And then the bottom row, I'm just dividing every number by 2. So 2 divided by 2 is 1, 6 divided by 2 is 3, negative 6 divided by 2 is negative 3. All right, and now we've got a 1. Okay, but I need my 1 to be up top, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to swap those 2 rows. So I'm going to write that I'm swapping row 2 and row 1. You use this kind of double-sided arrow to show that you're swapping them, as opposed to a single-sided arrow, meaning you're putting it somewhere different. Okay, and then I'm just going to swap these. So I'm just going to write 1, 3, -3 on the top, and 4, 3, 6 on the bottom. So the numbers didn't change at all. I just swapped which ones are on top and which ones are on the bottom. Okay, so now I've got my 1, right? That was part of the goal here, was to get that 1. So now I'm going to finish the column. So I need to get rid of this 4. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to multiply this row by -4, and then I'll add them together. Okay, so I'm going to do -4 times row 1 and add that to row 2. That's going to get me my 0, and I want the 0 in the second row. So I'm putting it in row 2. Okay, so let's do some work over here. So -4, -12, +12. That's that top row multiplied by -4. I'm adding it to row 2, so I'm just going to write that copied here. And when I add those together, that's going to give me 0, -9, 18. Okay, and I'm going to put that into row 2. So row 1 is just staying the same. And my new answer is going in row 2. So here's 0, -9, 18. And now my first column is done. All right, so we got our column done. Now we need to target another 1. So you always get the 1 first and then get zeros everywhere else in that column. So now we need a 1. I got to somehow make this guy into a 1, right? Well, if I add or subtract anything, right? Like if I somehow like multiply this row by something and add it, it's going to mess up my 0. Because anything I multiply the 1 by and add to 0, I'm going to get something other than 0. And then we'll be back where we started from. Okay, so what I'm going to do here instead is I'm going to divide this row by -9, excuse me, because that'll get you your 1. So I'm going to take row 2 and I'm going to divide it by -9 and put it back into row 2. If you get to this point, right, where you have zeros everywhere and just the one number left that you need to make into a 1, and you try to divide it and you get something that's a fraction, that's your cue that something went wrong somewhere and you did a miscalculation. Okay, the most annoying thing about matrices is that it is really easy to make a really simple calculation error, like adding wrong or dropping a negative sign or something, and then it totally screws you up for the rest of the problem. Okay, so you're going to have to be careful about checking for mistakes. So I'm dividing this row by -9, 0 divided by -9, -9 divided by itself, 18 divided by -9. Okay, most of the way there. We got a 1, we got a 1, we got a 0. We need to make this guy into a 0. So I'm going to take the row with the 1, multiply by the opposite of that number, and then add them together. So -3 times the second row, that's the one with the 1 in it, and adding that to the first row and putting it in the first row. So -3 times the second row will be 0, -3, 6. On the other row, I'm just copying, add those together, and that's going in my new row 1. Okay, so the second row stayed the same, and my new row 1 is 1, 0, 3. So now there's my reduced diagonal form matrix, right? I got 1s in the diagonal and 0s everywhere else. So this is going to be my solution. So the solution to this is the point 3, -2. And yes, you want to write that as a point. Okay, so I know that this feels really weird, but the steps are really the same a lot, okay? So like the major things that we did here was we either divided a row by a number, right? Or we swapped a row, but the major things, right? We divided a row by a number, or we did this thing with the 1s where you multiply a row with the 1 by the opposite of the number you want to get rid of and then add them together, right? So this one, I had a 1 and I wanted to get rid of the 4. So I multiplied that row by -4 and added it to the other one. This one I needed to get rid of a 3, so I multiplied by -3 and added it to the other row. Okay, and those are the same steps that we did on this one, right? I had a 1, I needed to get rid of a 3, so I multiplied by -3 and added them together. Okay, I divided a row by a number. This one I had to get rid of a 4, so I multiplied by -4 and added them together. Okay, so those are the steps that you're going to be doing. So it seems really crazy at first. It definitely takes some getting used to. Okay, but these are definitely doable. So let's try this one. So 4, 3, 1, -3, and then -3, -12. There's my matrix. That part's really easy. All right, I need a 1 in one of these two spots. I have a 1, it's down here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to swap my two rows. So I'm just going to say row 1, swap it with row 2. So now the 1, -3, -12 is on the top, and the 4, 3, -3 is on the bottom. There's my new matrix. Okay, so now we've got the 1 locked in place. Right, that's what I wanted. I have a 1 here. So now I want to get rid of that 4. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the row with a 1 in it, multiply it by -4, and then add the two rows together. So I'm doing -4 times row 1 plus row 2, and I'm putting it into row 2. Okay, so work off to the side. That'll be -4, 12, and then 48. Row 2, I'm just copying below it. And I add that together, 0, 15, 45. Okay, and I said I was going to put that in row 2. So in my new matrix, the top row, I didn't change. Bottom row is the new stuff that I have. There we go. Okay, so I've got this column finished. My next goal is that I need to get a 1, right? So I need this 15 to become a 1. And you can see here that this row, right, it will divide by 15, right, evenly. So that's going to be my next step. My next step is I'm going to take row 2 and I'm going to divide it by 15 and put it back into row 2. Okay, so top row is going to stay the same. 1, -3, -12. And then the bottom row, just dividing everything by 15. So that's going to be 0, 1, 3. Okay, I've got my new 1. I need to use it to clear out the rest of its column. So I got to get rid of that -3. So I'm going to multiply the 1 by +3 and then add them together. So I'm doing +3 times the second row. I'm adding it to the first row and I'm putting it into the first row because that's where I want the 0 to appear. So 3 times row 2, 0, 3, 9. Here's row 1. Add those together. There we go. All right, so new matrix. Bottom row stays the same because we didn't change that. And we said we were writing our new answer in the top row. So there's that. And there we go. We've got our reduced diagonal form. So I got 1s on the diagonal and 0s everywhere else. So then my answer is just those values off to the side. So my solution here is going to be the point -3, 3. And that's the solution to my system of equations. Okay, so again, this is just a different method of solving a system. You could have solved this system by elimination or substitution or graphing and gotten the same answer. Okay, so we're learning a different way. And I know that it seems like right now, like this is way harder, but that's just because you're more familiar with the other methods. Okay, and I promise you that when you start looking at solving a system of equations that's got 3 or 4 or 5 variables, using a matrix is so much easier than trying to do elimination or substitution or graphing. Okay, so that's why we're going to learn this. We're starting with small ones, even though there's an easier way of doing it, because eventually we're going to be looking at harder ones, and this will give you like the basic steps. Okay, so remember your steps. You can swap 2 rows. You can multiply a row by a number and add it to another row. That's a big one that we do a lot. You can divide a row by a number, okay? And you can do combinations of those. Okay, so those are really your only 3 options. Swapping rows, multiplying or dividing a row by a number, adding or subtracting it to another row. I stick with adding because fewer mistakes are made with adding, right? And then dividing a row by a number.